Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the SPE live event over energy transition with Rob West, the founder of Thunderset Energy. Maciel and I are so happy to be hosting another interview with SPE Live. This is a great platform. If you're not sure who Macy and I are, we are the co-hosts behind Flipping the Barrel podcast. And Flipping the Barrel is an empowering podcast that was created to shine a light on the oil field by sharing the stories of successful individuals in this industry, their best advice, and how they got there. We're really excited about this topic. This is a very challenging topic. With Maciel and I are both in the service industry. We understand how challenging this is for everybody. So what I want to note is please leave comments in the section on the live stream during this interview if you have any.
Before we get started, I wanted to give a quick overview of what we are going to be discussing today. As you saw in the title, we're going to be talking about the energy transition. As we all know, this is a challenging topic that we are currently facing. There are several aspects to the transition that is more than just, let's use more solar and wind energy. Rob West, who is the founder and lead analyst with Thunderset Energy, looks at the transition in 5 different ways: renewables, shale evolution, digital transformation, electrification, and environmental. In this SPE live broadcast, we will be talking with Rob, who will address the challenges and discuss the importance of oil and gas in the transition. Rob, thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Great to be here.
Well, Rob, to start off, for those who don't know, can you kind of discuss what the energy transition is?
Yeah, of course. So, the world's demand for energy is growing. Currently, around the entire world today, we're consuming about 60,000 terawatt hours of energy per year. By 2050, that's going to be above 100,000 terawatt hours per year. And if we do nothing, that means that CO2 emissions are going to go from 40 billion tons a year to about 80 billion tons a year. And so really the challenge in energy transition is how do we meet that energy demand that's going to be there and take out all the CO2?
Wow. Well, given the energy transition, what is the story behind Thunderset Energy and the kind of research that you do?
Well, defining the energy transition, Macy, isn't the hard part. The hard part is how. How do we do this? How do we get from here to this magic mystery decarbonized energy system? And before founding Thunderset Energy, I was a Wall Street analyst covering energy majors, and you go around and meet investors and talk about this topic. And one of the things you kind of often hear is, so our solution around energy transition is we're going to pull all the capital out from all of the all of the energy sector. And it strikes me that that's not a route to an energy transition. That's a route to an energy shortage. If you want to affect change, if you want to build, a credible zero carbon energy system, it's going to be about finding places to put capital in. So what are those things? And we find them, we write about them, we get the data and the models on them, so we can use data and models to say, how do we get there? And I'd love to show you that picture. And there it is, right? So this is the full picture of our models for energy transition and how we're going to get to a net zero by 2050. I'd actually like to go to page 2, if we could, to start. And what you'll see on this slide is a cost curve. So as I was saying, we've got to take out 80 billion tons a year of CO2 from the world's energy system by 2050. And what you'll see on this slide is that the technologies exist to do this almost 2 times over. We can do it 1.5 times over. There's over 140 billion tons of CO2 reduction possibilities on this chart. And the luxury this gives us is the ability to choose. We don't have to just do the energy transition whichever way we can choose the most economical route. And let me tell you what I think the most economical route looks like. And that's turning to page 3. So as you said, Macy, about 20% of all the decarbonization is going to come from renewables. Mm-hmm. This is getting wind and solar to about 40% of the world's grid, which is a tremendous achievement, and then getting the electricity to about 50% of the world's energy. So there's the pink bar on the chart. That's 20% of our total CO2 reduction. But we've got to get away from this idea that, just renewables is the sole solution. There are some wonderful opportunities in here, but it's part of a puzzle and certainly not the only piece. The single biggest piece of this puzzle, you'll see, is the light blue bar, and it's called coal to gas switching. So the way to think about this is if you generate a megawatt hour of power using coal, it's about 0.85 tons of CO2. If you generate that same megawatt hour of power from gas, it's about 0.3 tons of CO2. So simply by replacing coal with gas, you're taking out over 0.5 tons of CO2 per megawatt hour. And so if we can treble the demand for natural gas and kick out coal from the energy mix, that actually gets us a quarter of all the way to a decarbonized energy system. And there are some enabling technologies as part of that we might want to talk about. The next big chunk is around efficiency, and we'll talk about this. But before I go on, and let me just bore you a little bit longer with this slide, it's the final bar on the chart, which is called carbon offsets. And I want to mention this up front because it's so important. And actually just, flipping back to the slide we were previously on, flipping back to page 2, you'll see some of these carbon offset examples are some of the lowest cost opportunities on the planet. I'm talking about this. Carbon is a cycle. Man's CO2 emissions are about 40 billion tons a year. This means we're emitting about 11 billion tons a year of carbon, right? Carbon rather than CO2, and we can juggle between those units. Compared to that 11 billion tons of carbon coming from burning of fossil fuels, there's this broader cycle where all the plants in the world currently, every year take out 120 billion tons of carbon. Now, some of that gets respired back out, some of that gets decomposes, but that sink of all the forests in the world today is taking about 10 billion tons of CO2 out of the system every year. And really the idea here is nature-based solutions. So, we've lost a third of the world's forests since pre-industrial times. Reforesting 3 billion acres could create a 15 billion ton CO2 sink. A third of all the CO2 in the atmosphere since post-industrial times has come from soil degradation. Every year when you plow up the soil, you release the carbon that's locked in the soil. And so we've gone from about 4% carbon in our soils to about 1 to 2%. And restoring that soil carbon can absorb another 3 to 15 billion tons of CO2. And really, this is what people refer to when they're talking about nature-based solutions to climate change. They're right at the bottom of the cost curve. And this creates the ability, for what I've got on page 5. And what you have here is a picture of a fully decarbonized energy system. I like to put it in context, going all the way back to 1750, to see how the evolution has changed. Mm-hmm. But this is a world where effectively the route is this. We have to make oil and gas as clean and efficient as possible. We have to really scale up the lower carbon fossil fuels, which is gas, and particularly the cleanest gas. And we have to capture and offset all of that CO2 using capture technologies and nature-based solutions. And this is the 100-mile overview. Mm-hmm. I suspect what we'll do throughout this discussion is we'll go a little bit further into the weeds of how we actually do this.
The topics that you've discussed so far kind of point to deforestation as even being a large piece of this. And being in the oil industry, I do feel like we usually have all of the light shined on us as we are the major component of what's going on. But based on kind of what you're showing us here, it looks like there's other industries that probably rank higher than we do.
Yeah, Jamie, I like that point. Let's have a look at page 10 of the slides. There's something in this that I think is really, really crucial. We've got to get away from demonization in this debate. There's this kind of temptation to paint the world as black and white and say oil and gas equals bad and everything else equals basically fine. Well, false. Here's a breakdown of all of the CO2 emissions around the world, sector by sector by sector. And my favorite kind of observation on this chart, just to pick a single bar, is that by 2025, the energy used to power the internet is going to be more than the CO2 footprint of the global gas industry. That's the production and distribution of gas, not the consumption. But what is the answer here? A university student's going to be campaigning that we should divest from Facebook and Google because of the CO2 footprint of powering the internet. No, what I think you kind of take away from this is that every single industry, we've got to be figuring out what are we going to do to lower our emissions. And it has to be something that improves our competitiveness, improves our economics. We aren't going to be able to do this if it makes our companies uncompetitive. And really, that's the core of what our work focuses on: is what are those investable opportunities where you can earn a return, taking out CO2 from your business. And there are hundreds of these opportunities in oil and gas.
Can you talk a little bit about the Paris Agreement and mainly how they are set at a global level, and what do they mean at a regional country level? Because they're obviously very different between developed versus developing economies. They're going to be different. They're going to be facing different opportunities and challenges. How do we address that?
Well, I think this is a really important question. If you think about oil, I like this example. In the developed world, the average person consumes 13 barrels of oil, per year. That's the top billion of us on the planet. The other 6.5 billion of us on the planet consume about 3 barrels of oil per person per year. And this chart I showed you of how CO2 emissions could double by 2050. This is not because people in the emerging world are going to go from 3 to 13. It's because they're going to go from 3 to 4. It's still going to be 70% below the energy consumption of people in the developed world. And so I think one of the most important aspects of a kind of viable energy transition is we can't do this by going to people in the emerging world and saying, so what we want you to do is never enjoy the access to energy that we enjoy. We have to do it by taking actual solutions to people that can make the energy system better for them. And I think it's going to come bottom up through specific technologies rather than top down through multinational agreements. Now, some aspects of these multinational agreements can help and can be important. We could talk about the impacts of a CO2 price, which would be a wonderful step forward. But like I said, I think this is going to come from the bottom up, from real gritty engineering solutions that in our research, and we like to nerd out over and write about and kind of get excited about.
How do you think we're going to measure who's decarbonizing and who's not? Like, who's actually using these technologies moving forward? I know that we can see what the US is doing because we're very open. You can see what Paris, they made the Paris Agreement that's supposed to be worldwide, but how can you say that other countries are going to be doing the same thing as we're all going to be in this together?
Yeah, well, we've got to have data on this, and there are some really interesting things on this front. If you look at page 11 of the slides, here's an example of this, which we can talk about. So this is what nerdy analysts can do, to answer the question, is to look at different resources and screen the higher cost and the lower cost examples. And I'm not showing this chart to kind of beat up people at the top of the curve, but just to present the data. And really, this is the first challenge, is getting the data out there. So commercializing the average barrel of oil around the industry takes about 60 kilograms of CO2. When we burn that oil, there's about 350 kilograms of CO2 as well, but that comes later. Here, we're just focusing on the producers and the refiners and the energy companies. And some of these resources are, lower carbon than others. And one thing that, we're observing in the capital markets is much more of a willingness to fund the lower carbon resources and allocate capital there. And so that's the first component. This actually gets a little bit more gritty if we turn over the page to page 13. I'm not going to talk about any specific chart here particularly, but like you say, we can get really good data on this company by company by company. So the top left-hand chart here is ranking all of the CO2, all of the producers in the Bakken according to their CO2 intensity per barrel of production. And you can see that the highest CO2 companies, are emitting 3 to 4 times more CO2 per barrel than the lowest carbon companies. And so these low carbon companies, we got to be calling them out and say, great job. And investors are doing this and giving these companies, higher multiples and lower capital costs. Conversely, if you're on the upper end of this chart, the data is there, and people are coming to these companies saying, why? Why aren't you being more efficient? And so this is it's something we can look across, every single sector to pick out the higher cost, higher carbon, lower carbon companies and show, the best practices. There's a final component, Jamie has answered your question, which is tracking this. And one of the things that really excites me is we're getting better and better data to track this at a multinational level. I'll give you an example in the sphere of methane emissions, right? Important issue. If we leak 3% of the gas from the gas value chain as we produce it, you can argue falsely, but you can argue that gas is dirtier than coal. The reason it's falsely is because the methane emissions from producing coal are higher than the methane emissions from producing gas, because coal tends to desorb from methane tends to desorb from coal when you pull it out of the ground. But this is a really important issue for our industry, is to avoid methane emissions. And there are now satellites that are going to be in orbit by 2022, 2023, where we can see methane emissions down to effectively 100 meters by 100 meters from space, with a threshold of 50 kilograms per hour. So that if you're a methane emitter and you have leaky equipment, you can't hide by just not reporting the data to a national regulator. It's going to be visible and people are going to be quantifying it. So when there's this great adage that what gets inspected gets respected. And whether we're talking about different resource types or different companies within resource types or methane emissions from an individual well pad, more and more data is coming good to actually inspect this stuff and thus get it respected and cleaned up.
As you mentioned, it seems like most of the population always demonizes somehow oil and gas or looks into what we're doing. Can you talk a little bit about how other different industries are responsible as well for decarbonizing?
Sure. I guess the best way to go back and look at that is on page 10. There's lots of different examples here. I mean, the most one of the most widely discussed ones is in the cement industry. This is around you can do numbers as much as 4 billion tons of emissions coming from cement. We've got a little bit lower here at 6% of all the world's emissions. And it's because, when you're making cement, you're effectively heating up calcium carbonate so that it breaks down into calcium oxide and CO2. And the calcium oxide is clinker and it becomes a binder for all this material that goes into cement. And the CO2 just goes into the atmosphere. So, you'll have a ton of emissions per ton of cement. And in this industry, there are some wonderful technologies coming through. I'll give you one of my favorite examples, a company called Solidia, which is using CO2 in the curing process of cement instead of water, and actually takes out 70% of the CO2 from the cement manufacturing process. And in the process of doing this, on our numbers, they're taking out about 5% of the costs as well. So here's a product that's cheaper, it's lower carbon, and I think you can scale that up to take out several 100 million tons a year of CO2 from the system. Watch out, because if you let me, I will bore you just talking about every single bar on this chart. So interrupt me when you're bored. There's another one that I love in the spirit of plastics. So plastics, you can see it here. It's 4% of the world's emissions. Why don't we recycle more plastics? Because we can't, right? The kind of mechanical recycling that takes place around the industry today is really restricted to very pure, very sorted PET and some polyethylenes.
Well, Rob, we can see that there's definitely other industries that are impacting the CO2 emissions and the footprint for needs for decarbonization. Can we focus a little bit on the technologies for decarbonization when it comes to oil and gas, like carbon capture, utilization, and storage? Is there anything that you can explain that we're doing today? And then also where that sits, is it upstream versus midstream versus downstream?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think we should go back to page, page 2, which is our cost curve. So, we have some potential to do carbon capture and storage around the oil and gas industry, but it's got challenges, and here's what they are. When you burn gas in a industrial facility, what comes out of the chimney, the flue stack, is this horrible soup of CO2 and nitrogen. And the nitrogen is in there because air is 80% nitrogen, and so when you burn a fuel in air, you end up with a lot of nitrogen in the exhaust. And the process to take out that CO2, the main one uses the amine process, where this class of chemicals called amines absorbs CO2 and separates it out. This costs about $50 a ton. And after we do this, we have to steam treat the amines to regenerate them, which means that we end up using about 15 to 30% of all the energy that we got in the first place from burning the fossil fuels to run that amine cycle and decarbonize the fossil fuels. And then you have to pay somewhere between $5 and $50 a ton to dispose of that CO2 by sticking it in the ground. So all in, we're going to be between $55 and $100 a ton on conventional CO2 capture. And it gets harder and harder the smaller the unit that you're decarbonizing. I mean, there are some interesting numbers. If you wanted to decarbonize a whole refinery, it would be costing something like $300 a ton, because you'd have to go, unit by unit by unit through every little boiler around the refinery, and the smaller they get, the higher the cost. Mm-hmm. So, there are some exciting things coming through that can make this cheaper on the technology side. One on power generation is a technology called Oxy Combustion. And what you're doing here is you're burning gas in a pure atmosphere of CO2 and just enough air, just enough oxygen so that the gas will burn. And this means that what's coming out of this reactor isn't this nasty soup of nitrogen and CO2, but it's a pure stream of CO2 which can go straight into sequestration. You don't have to do that nitrogen separation step. So this is going to get the costs of carbon capture down probably by a factor of half. And we have some of these plants in our models of decarbonizing the energy mix. Really exciting technology. The first plants being tested in La Porte in Texas. There's about half a dozen other plants that are in various stages of planning to ramp this up. There's lots of things in this category. There's also really exciting advances in materials. I'll give you an example. There's a type of material called a metal organic framework. 1 teaspoon of this material, it's so porous that it has the same surface area as an American football field. And these things can absorb CO2 with about 80 to 90% less energy than the amine process. And there are companies commercializing this. Last year it made some headlines. ExxonMobil bought into a company called Mosaic Materials that is, commercializing some of these. Aramco is pursuing some of these. Chevron has been filing patents around this. And again, so this is the sort of thing that is not quite technically ready yet, but you can start building into the energy transition models and going to make CO2 capture more efficient. And there's lots of examples like that, lots of progress.
So people look to oil and gas, like you mentioned, they look at us to say, hey, solve the CO2 problem, right? Many people usually blame the oil and gas industry. But as we discussed, the points of oil and gas production are often geographically very different to where the majority of the CO2 is actually produced. How do we address that differences?
Well, I think about it like this. I think about it like, the world wants to, take out all of the CO2 from the energy system. When people want something, that's a commercial opportunity. When people have a need, there's an ability for someone to come and fulfill that need, and And that's how businesses make money. And that actually creates, an exceptional opportunity for oil and gas in the energy transition, because people want decarbonized energy, and we can give it to them. So here's the example that I think is really interesting. Let's say we buy up some pasture land, and we take this pasture land and we convert it into forests, right? And when you plant forests on land, it tends to add about it takes out about 5 tons of CO2 per acre per year. And what we can do is we can package up those CO2 offsets, those CO2 credits, and we can sell them. If you have a gallon of gasoline sold at the pump, burning that gallon of gasoline emits about 9 kilograms of CO2. So if we were to sell those CO2 credits from our forestry project at, say, $50 a ton, which is about 50 cents per gallon, we could make a margin not just on providing and supplying gasoline. We can make a margin on providing and supplying the carbon credits that turn that gasoline into zero carbon gasoline. Now, I gave you numbers there at $50 a ton. You can possibly do this at $10 a ton, and we've done models of how you would. Mm-hmm. But I think what's really interesting, thinking about the cost curves, is over here in the US, we already have what's called the blender's tax credit for biofuels, particularly renewable diesel. And with the blender's tax credit, which is $1 per gallon, you're effectively already paying $200 per ton for CO2 offsets in your fuels. So why pay $200 a ton when you could only pay 10 or 50? And so this model of commercializing carbon credits, we can make the ability there for consumers who want zero carbon energy. We can give you zero carbon energy, and we can make a margin in the process that improves the fuel retail margins by somewhere between 15 and 25% for a fossil fuel retailer. And among our clients, we talk with companies who are doing this and really scaling this up and really getting excited about how we could build a net zero energy business. And you run numbers on this, I think you can uplift the valuation of a leading energy company by 50% by getting this right, through the margin uplifts, the lower capital costs, and by getting into the lowest cost opportunities for driving the energy transition forwards.
So with that comment, you're kind of suggesting that the oil and gas industry can still survive in a fully decarbonized state by possibly outsourcing their carbon credits or doing something in favor to basically cancel out maybe the carbon that they do emit. Is that kind of the solution?
That's right. I think we can do both. So I think the first port of call is to make the emissions in our upstream, midstream, downstream processes as low as they possibly can be. And the best companies are doing this. We've just been through 3,000 patents filed around the largest energy companies in 2019, and that the efficiency gains that companies are chasing here, it is really incredible. Whether it's next generation catalysts or digital technologies or fully subsea developments that are powered from renewable energy onshore, this industry is doing everything it can at some of these leading companies to get its Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions down. But in addition to that, what I'm saying is we also have an opportunity to sell carbon credits to the purchase of our fuel, so that effectively they're buying a zero carbon product. And that is an extra business opportunity for the oil and gas industry, to do it in-house, to create their own nature-based carbon offsets and commercialize those. And if you'll permit me, I'd love to do some numbers on this, because I think they're so interesting. You've got my fireplace, wrong hand, fireplace behind me. I'm failing to be coordinated and point backwards. If you look at the average house, the average household in the developed world, we burn 2.6 tons of CO2 per year in heating. It costs about $800 per household per year, to heat our households. I'm in Connecticut. It gets ridiculously cold in the winter. I would like to find a zero carbon way of heating my household. So here are the options. If the company supplying gas to my house would sell me carbon credits bundled in with the price of my gas in my efficient gas boiler, I could decarbonize my entire household for about $50 per year. $50, right? And this is, this is doable.
Mm-hmm.
We can also look at other solutions like running a household purely on renewables for your heating, or switching to green hydrogen, or switching to biogas that comes from the anaerobic digestion of organic material. This would increase my household heating bill by somewhere between $600 and $2,600 per year. When you model through the numbers of this. And so kind of the point I'm making is when you spend the time modeling this through of how we can decarbonize something as simple as my household heating bill or your household heating bill, I really want to choose the low cost option, and I don't want my household heating bill to go up by $2,600 per year. And this is why I think energy companies have such a big role to play in doing this, and they can make good returns in the process.
So we have a question from YouTube, and it says, Rob, how could Canadian oil sands fit within your energy transition roadmap? They are costly and carbon intensive, but are also subject to strict environmental regulations.
Right. So, what's really interesting about this is the chart that I think you saw on that previous slide is an average. And we got the data on this. Actually, there are some Canadian oil sands producers using best-in-class technology where their total CO2 footprint is not the 170 kilograms per barrel that I've shown in that chart, but it can be as low as 70. And this is optimizing steam oil ratios. This is recycling waste heat. So the best companies using the best technologies can get this down to a level that's not dissimilar from other resources. The second component is land. So the biggest challenge for nature-based solutions is they take land. On our numbers, we know we need to find 3 billion acres from around the world. The kind of estimates in academic papers range from 2 billion to 8 billion acres that you could reforest. So our 3 billion acres is a good conservative number. We have the land in the Canadian oil and gas industry and sort of broader country, but we can generate a lot of carbon offsets and turn our oil sands, even oil sands, into low carbon fuels. And it's going to be harder than starting with the lower carbon resources. But I think the data that I've seen shows that companies who want to do this can do it.
Rob, I know one of the first times we talked, you spoke about an operator who had been currently doing this and been working in the energy transition and found a way to decarbonize. Can you speak about that?
I definitely can, but I'm sorry, I'm having a mental blank and not 100% sure I remember which specific example that was.
I believe it was Oxy.
Oh, right. Okay. Well, so look, I got to say, a lot of the research that we do is based on patents and technical papers. And something that is, really fascinating, if you trawl through all these patents and technical papers, is sometimes you find stuff and you think, I did not know this company was doing that. And in the case of Oxy, one of the things that I find really intriguing is the way we're progressing CO2 enhanced oil recovery in resource plays like the Permian. And this is really interesting. If you think about a tight reservoir, what we mean when we say it's tight is that it contains flow. And because it contains flow, you can do a type of enhanced oil recovery called huff and puff. What you're doing here is you're taking this shale well, this old depleted shale well, and you're going back and you're pressuring it up with gas, particularly with CO2. And CO2, it mobilizes oil, it dissolves oil. There's some papers, interesting research out of Texas A&M and University of North Dakota showing that possibly the CO2 is actually even getting into the unfracked matrix of the rock and causing the oil molecules trapped there to swell and to flow into the wellbore. So we can huff these wellbores full of CO2 and then puff that CO2 back, and we'll entrain oil in that CO2 that comes back. And you can do somewhere around a dozen to 20 cycles of huff and puff, and potentially get an extra 800,000 barrels to 1 million barrels out of a shale well at a break even of $40 per barrel. In the process, you would put about 20,000 tons of CO2 down each well, and it would stay there. So if you were to do this, and we've done numbers of this, you could effectively make the Permian a CO2 neutral resource. And as you said, Oxy has been one of the most prominent filers of patents and technical papers around this. Their big challenge is how do we get the CO2 into the Permian? And they're using that Oxy Combustion technology I talked about earlier. So that the roadmap might look like this. It might look like electrify as much as you can within your Permian operations. Fuel as much of that electrification as possible using Oxy Combustion's decarbonized gas. Recycle the CO2 from your Oxy Combustion decarbonized gas to feed your huff and puffs to uplift your production and sequester CO2 in the process. And this is something you see in the technical literature. The amount of papers into this, it went from number 13 of all themes by SPE research papers to number 4 of all themes by SPE research papers, but really in the last 18 months. This is on our classification of SPE papers. And just a great example of how our industry can be front-footed and find opportunities that drive the transition forwards. So if you want more on that, there's a research note on our website called "Can the Permian Become CO2 Neutral?" And teaser, we think the answer is yes. So that's the kind of rough overview on that one.
You've also mentioned that refineries could cut their emission and boost their margins. How exactly would that work?
Yeah, well, the best way to do this, we touched earlier on going around and retrofitting a carbon capture unit to every single boiler in a refinery that isn't really economically feasible in an industry that makes $1 per year of $1 per barrel of net margins per year. The idea that excites us is, if you go through those 3,000 patents that I mentioned around the kind of largest energy companies, what's fascinating is 800 of them are the catalysts, next generation catalysts. And if you think about what a catalyst is, it's a material that lowers the energy required for a chemical reaction without being used up in the process. And looking across the entire refining industry, we think the best-in-class catalysts for every subunit of a refinery, we could take out about 80 degrees centigrade from the average refinery unit, which is equivalent to saving about 15% of the CO2 emissions around the refining sector, while uplifting refining margins by over $1 per barrel. And so, I think I'm going to resist the temptation to go into, each one of these 800 catalysts one by one. But there are some great examples there that we can certainly talk more about them if you'd like to.
Well, I would like to go to a viewer's comment. I think it's pretty interesting given the topics we've been discussing. They've asked, do you think we can balance the economics versus environmental impact? If it's economical, I feel everybody would be doing it, but that doesn't seem to be the case. Is there more incentive needed from the government, such as 45Q carbon tax credit in the US?
Yeah, it's a great question. It comes back to that cost curve that I showed you on that very first slide. It's on page 2. It might be worth just kind of flashing it up again. If you look at the majority of this chart, we need to have people paying for CO2. It's a classic kind of economist's externality. CO2 is emitted by by companies, but the social costs of that CO2 apply to everybody. So we have to start finding a price for CO2 to do the majority of this reforestation. And we talked about consumers who might be willing to pay to offset their carbon. That was my example of I'd happily pay another $50 a year for my decarbonizing my household heating bill. Government mandated CO2 prices could really help. I'll give you an interesting example in the United States. I mean, if we were to put in something like a $40 per ton CO2 price in real terms, and slowly increase from that level, on our numbers, some really interesting things would start happening. The first one is that you would take about 400 million tons a year of coal and switch it to gas almost overnight. That would increase gas demand by about 13 billion cubic feet a day. And it's because, gas-fired generation is 70% lower CO2 than coal-fired generation. And we still have about 25% coal generation in our power mix in the US. So a $40 CO2 price, you can look across the whole world, and pretty much this is sufficient to incentivize coal to gas switching everywhere. And we do need a CO2 price for it. Then, going up the curve, the higher the CO2 price gets, the more and more of this stuff we're going to unlock. And I think what's interesting about this is, if we get the CO2 price in the United States to about $80 a ton, on our numbers, you could decarbonize the entire United States. You'd create, over $200 billion a year of CO2 revenues. You'd create $130 billion a year of new investment. You'd create as much as 500,000 jobs per year. And this is why a sort of gently escalating CO2 price actually could unlock so many parts of this decarbonization. And I got a final point about this, which is what we have at the moment. It's kind of like kingmaker policies, right? So I gave that example of renewable diesel earlier in the discussion. With that blender's tax credit that exists right now, we're effectively going to companies in renewable diesel, and we're just saying, your company, we're going to unlock a 25% IRR for you, commercializing renewable diesel, which is effective to paying $200 a ton for CO2 offsets. But why? Why do we want to be kingmakers for the renewable diesel industry when there are lots of other lower cost ways of doing CO2 reduction? And kind of the beauty of a CO2 price is it creates a level playing field where, if you work at a refinery, if you work in the oil field and you find some project that can take out CO2 from your project here, you can go and do it, and you can get a tax credit or a CO2 offset for doing it, rather than kind of policymakers picking and choosing that one and that one and that one because they lobbied for it, and so we should just get a blanket CO2 price. To me, this seems like a kind of no-brainer of really getting the energy transition going.
We have another question from Philip from YouTube, and he says, would you say it would be unexacting for emerging countries to switch to renewable efficiently, seeing as they have more access to energy sources? Oil and gas isn't consumed as much as a developing country. He said, you gave the example of individuals versus barrel consumption in an emerging country. The average person consumes 3 barrels per year.
That's right. So I think that the biggest challenge with renewables is that they're very good for getting a portion of every single electricity grid decarbonized. But once you get to about 20% renewables in your grid, something a little bit challenging starts happening, and it's this. Renewables are volatile. If you look in California, renewable generation from solar in the summer is 2x solar generation in the winter. This is real data, and we have this data. If you look at wind turbines offshore in the UK, they generate below 90% of their capacity 90% of the time. They generate below 80% of their capacity 80% of the time. They generate below 10% of their capacity 10% of the time. the amount they produce, it varies, it comes and goes. And what this means is that once you get to about 20% renewables in an energy mix, then on 5% of the days, in the windiest, sunniest moments of those windiest, sunniest days, renewables are running full blast, and they are producing 100% of the variable dispatch needed in that electricity grid. And so if you want to ramp up renewables further, beyond that 20%, what do you do with the renewables in those windy, sunny moments on those windy, sunny days? And the answer is the most economic thing, the best thing you can do is curtail them. You just don't let them generate. And that's fine. They're not quite as efficient. The costs go up a little bit. We're not talking a massive increase. We're talking 6 cents a kilowatt hour to 7 cents a kilowatt hour. But by the time you're getting renewables to 50% of the grid, actually it means that a third of the time the grid is full of renewable energy and everything else has had to shut off, and power prices have gone to zero, and incremental renewables can't generate. And by this point, unless you have widely distributed battery storage, which is really expensive, the cost of renewables is suddenly 20 cents a kilowatt hour. So treble, today's levels. And again, there's models behind all of this up on our website. So I think the answer to this question is every grid you model, if you want to do the cheapest, energy transition, you want to be getting renewables to about 40% of that grid in total. Not the whole solution, not nothing, that 40%. And that 40% is still a wonderful running room for the renewables industry.
Mm-hmm.
Have y'all done any data on the maintenance required for the renewable, like the solar and then the windmills? I mean, I've heard a lot about how you can't really, how the way the windmills are created, you can't really decompose or recycle the materials that are used. I've heard a lot around the windmills actually devastating flocks of birds. I've heard about the solar devastating acres and acres of land to build these solar plants. So when you look at that compared to the footprint of really an oil and gas pad or rig, I mean, when that rig and everything moves away after that well's completed, we replant years later, you can't even tell that anything was there. I feel like that's a very big advantage when it comes to producing oil versus when you look at solar. Have y'all done any research around that?
Yeah, I think this is where numbers become really important. There's going back to that kind of black and white thinking I was talking about earlier. We definitely don't want to be thinking oil and gas equals bad, everything else equals 100% fine. Things fall on a spectrum, and that spectrum has complexity. But the way I think about it is that if you look all in at an oil and gas asset, the average around the industry is probably 320 kilograms per BOE for gas of CO2 emissions. Is probably 360 kilograms of CO2 per BOE for oil, all in. For solar, the average is probably around 90. For wind, the average is probably around 50. It means that a solar asset does take CO2 to produce. It does take some of those issues that you rightly raised. But on an all-in basis, shifting to a large portion of wind and solar in the energy mix is going to do a net saving. We have to do it responsibly. We have to do it in the right way, but it is going to be a benefit. I mean, the really interesting one on kind of new energies technologies is electric vehicles. Because if you look at the data on an electric vehicle, making a Tesla burns about 120 MCF of gas for the energy to make a typical 450 kilogram battery, which means that it takes about 4 years for an electric vehicle to repay the energy costs of producing it. And because electric vehicle numbers are rising exponentially, the extra energy we use every year to make more electric vehicles is actually more than the extra energy saved every year from last year's electric vehicles. So on our numbers, electric vehicles actually increase fossil fuel demand all the way out to 2035. They do, help decarbonize on a very long-term basis, but it takes 4 years for every electric vehicle to repay the energy costs of manufacturing it.
Wow. Well, that's really interesting. Claude from LinkedIn said, for those coming in late like myself, what are the 3 main takeaways from this key topic? And by the way, everybody, you can listen to this, replay it afterwards. It will be, but if you don't have time, what would you say are the top 3 things that people should take away from this message?
Well, I'm going to overshoot my budget, and I'm going to give you 4. Kind of the four virtues for achieving a fully decarbonized energy mix as an energy company. The first one is make the right shifts. The shifts to deliver an energy transition can all be ranked on a cost curve. We can decarbonize the entire world for a CO2 price below $80 a ton. We should get behind those technologies that work below $80 a ton, and we should resist the high cost technologies that cost between $100 and $1,000 a ton, because they might end up destroying value. The second is that every single industry on the planet should be looking to lower its CO2. It's not about vilifying oil and gas. It's about going through every single sector and subsector, and lower carbon companies, within those sectors can be 75 to 80% lower than higher carbon companies within those sectors. And every company is going to be driving that, will be rewarded with lower capital costs and higher multiples for doing so. The third one is about technologies. I mean, it all comes down to technologies in doing an energy transition. And it's fascinating. We find a 50 to 80% correlation between the returns on capital in the energy industry and the number of patents filed by different companies, year after year. Technology leaders generate excess returns in a commodity industry, and we're going to need more of that to do the energy transition. And the final one is CO2 offsets. This is the lowest cost opportunity to decarbonize the world. It does 18 billion tons of CO2 reductions on our numbers by 2050. Energy companies can sell those carbon credits and uplift their retail margins at the same time. And this points us to a system that will be fully decarbonized, but would still be having 85 million barrels a day of oil and 400 TCF of gas per year in a fully decarbonized energy system that delivers us this energy transition.
Rob, thank you so much for that summary on those 4 topics. And one thing I want to note is it's great what Thunderset Energy is doing, moving us forward, and also highlighting the fact that oil and gas is here to stay, and that there is ways for us to work in this environment and still decarbonize at the same time. For anybody interested, this live event will be broadcasted, and you can watch it at a later time. If you came in on the later end of this. And then also you can find more on Rob at thundersetenergy.com. And then you can also follow Maciel and I on Flipping the Barrel for more info about our interviews coming forward.
So yeah, Rob, thank you so much. And thank you everybody for joining us today.
Thanks for the great discussion. Thank you.